Bridges of Sincerity. Eleanor Grant woke before dawn, as she always did, to the steady hum of the city stirring to life beyond her narrow apartment window. The traffic lights blinked red and orange across the street. The distant sirens wove through the chill morning air. She dressed quietly, mindful not to wake her roommate, and stepped into the kitchen, where the kettle began its gentle whistle. 2 years earlier, Eleanor had been a starry-eyed graduate from a prestigious university, convinced she would conquer the world with bold ideas and tireless drive. But reality had been more elusive. She found herself in a public interest nonprofit, drafting grant proposals that too often disappeared into bureaucracy. People spoke of passion, of purpose, but her idealism felt threadbare. There were days when she wondered if true conviction still existed, or if it was merely a word to soothe newcomers. That morning, as Eleanor poured water over the coffee grounds, she glanced at the framed quote on her wall: "Sincerity touches unseen hearts." Serving the many, one invites responsibility beyond self. She had translated and inscribed it herself after discovering an ancient aphorism that spoke of genuine intent and communal duty. It reminded her that honest actions, however small, could ripple farther than any grand gesture. When the coffee was steeped, she picked up her satchel, a battered leather messenger bag, and headed out. The subway station was alive with commuters clutching cell phones and lattes. Amid the rush, Eleanor spotted Mrs. Lynn, the elderly woman who lived across the hall, struggling with grocery bags. Without hesitation, Eleanor diverted from her usual path, knelt, and offered her assistance. As she lifted the heavier bag, Mrs. Lynn's eyes shone with gratitude, more luminous than any morning star. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Lynn said, balancing her purchases. "You have a kind heart." Eleanor felt warmth spread in her chest. It was a small kindness, but sincere. And that sincerity, she believed, had a power all its own. Later, at the nonprofit office, she found her colleagues already gathered for the weekly town hall meeting. Eleanor had prepared a presentation on community-driven outreach programs. As she set up her laptop, she thought of the quote, "Serving the many invites responsibility." Today, she would propose a pilot program to train volunteers in home visits, an initiative that would rely less on paperwork and more on genuine human connection. She took a deep breath, clicked to the first slide, and looked around the room. Faces met her gaze. Some curious, some skeptical. Eleanor began to speak, her voice steady. Each word was measured, honest. She recounted stories of neighbors helping neighbors, of strangers forging bonds through simple acts. The room grew quiet, attentive. By the time she finished, there was a hush, punctuated only by the rustle of papers and the distant hum of the city. In that silence, Eleanor realized that her sincerity had indeed touched unseen hearts. Perhaps hers most of all. Eleanor left the meeting with a cautious optimism. The pilot program had been approved for a small neighborhood block. Just 10 volunteers and a handful of households. But it was enough. She spent the afternoon drafting volunteer manuals, blending her meticulous notes with the warmth of human stories she'd collected. Mrs. Alvarez, who baked extra pan dulce for lonely neighbors. Jamal, the high school student tutoring younger children after school. And Natalie, who transformed her front porch into an open-air library. As twilight settled, Eleanor joined her team of volunteers in the community center's faded gymnasium. The linoleum floor bore scuffs from decades of basketball games, and the walls were decorated with peeling flyers for past events. Yet beneath the wear, there was life. Laughter echoed from a youth choir practicing nearby, and the scent of freshly scrubbed floors mingled with the tang of chalk dust. She greeted each volunteer by name, sharing the story she'd gathered. "When you knock on a door," she told them, "remember that your sincerity is the bridge." No brochure, no policy can replace a genuine smile or a listening ear. The volunteers nodded, some exchanging nervous glances. Eleanor handed out schedules and identification badges, but more importantly, she urged them to treat each visit as an invitation, not an obligation. "Ask questions," she said. Learn what matters to them. Offer what you can, and if you can't, be honest. People see through polished speeches, but they welcome authenticity. Later that evening, as Eleanor walked home under the glow of street lamps, she reflected on her own doubts. Twice she had been passed over for promotion. Twice she'd questioned whether she belonged in this line of work. But tonight, she felt a quiet certainty that her purpose lay not in titles or accolades, but in each small connection forged across that gymnasium floor, in every conversation that unfolded over chipped kitchen tables. At her apartment, Eleanor paused by the window. The city lights flickered like a constellation brought down to earth. She sipped her lukewarm tea and thought of the aphorism on her wall. True intent, she knew, was not proven in grand declarations, but in every choice to extend herself, again and again, toward the humanity in others. Tomorrow, the volunteers would knock on their first doors. Eleanor allowed herself a moment of rest, knowing that before sunrise, she would be there, stirring the kettle once more, ready to lend her hands, her ears, and her unwavering sincerity. The next morning, Eleanor rose as the first light touched the horizon. She moved through her routine with gentle purpose. Coffee brewed, satchel slung, and walked to the neighborhood block that would be her team's proving ground. Volunteers had gathered at sunrise, faces a mix of excitement and nerves, clipboards in hand. Eleanor guided them through a final briefing in the courtyard of a red brick apartment building. "Remember," she said, "we're here to listen before we speak, to observe before we prescribe. Each house is its own universe." She paused, letting the words settle as birds gathered on the wrought iron fence. Their first stop was Unit 4B. 4B. A single mother, Marisol, answered the door, her toddler clutching at her skirt. The volunteer introduced herself, but it was Eleanor's warm welcome that set Marisol at ease. They sat at a small kitchen table, enamel cups of coffee before them, and Eleanor simply asked, "What brings you hope these days?" Marisol's eyes brightened. She spoke of her aspirations for her child, of the long hours at the diner, of the loneliness that settled in after the day's end. The volunteer took notes, but Eleanor noticed the deeper shift. Marisol's shoulders relaxed, her voice found its strength again. Before they left, they offered a list of local support groups and committed to follow up next week. Door after door, the pattern repeated. At the elderly Mr. Huang's apartment, they rewired a flickering lamp. At the Perez family's home, they arranged a small bookshelf to house treasured photographs. Each act was modest. No gala announcements or press releases. But each left behind a tangible change and a spark of connection. By midday, Eleanor felt the familiar wear of responsibility, yet also a buoyant sense of purpose. She watched volunteers grow confident, shifting from scripted lines to spontaneous conversation. Sincerity, she realized, was most potent when embedded in genuine care. Late that afternoon, the team reconvened to share reflections. A high school volunteer spoke of learning more from listening than from lecturing. Another admitted that fear had held her back. That meeting neighbors felt intimidating, until she discovered that her openness was the key. Eleanor smiled, knowing that these small revelations were the true measures of success. As dusk approached, Eleanor walked alone along a narrow alley dotted with graffiti art. A spray-painted phrase caught her eye: "Authenticity is the pulse of community." She paused, the echo of her own mantra mirrored in vivid color. The city's beating heart, she thought, was composed of lives intersecting in honest moments. Returning home, she paused by her wall inscription one last time. The lines etched beneath her coffee stain. "Sincerity touches unseen hearts. Serving the many invites responsibility beyond self," had guided each decision today. And as she prepared for sleep, Eleanor understood that her journey was not toward a final destination, but along an endless path, one where every sincere gesture, however small, had the power to transform both giver and receiver. Dawn arrived once more, pale and unhurried, as Eleanor stepped into the quiet street. In the soft light, the block looked peaceful. a canvas awaiting fresh strokes of human kindness. Today would be different. The pilot program's second week, and the neighborhood had begun to feel less like strangers' doors and more like the interconnected homes of a single living organism. Eleanor gathered her volunteers in a circle beneath the broad canopy of an old oak in the community garden. Flowers nodded gently in the breeze, and the air carried hints of lavender and damp earth. She held up a small mason jar filled with pebbles. Each pebble, she said, represents a moment of sincerity you've shared. A listening ear, a thoughtful question, a helpful hand. Today, I invite you to listen to the pebbles, not the plans. They passed the jar around. One by one, volunteers removed a pebble and spoke of a moment that mattered most to them. A nurse in training recalled how simply offering water to a dehydrated neighbor had sparked a deeper conversation about health resources. A retiree remembered how fixing a loose doorknob had unlocked years of stories from a tenant who hadn't otherwise opened up. When the jar was empty, Eleanor spoke softly. These are the true measures of our work. Small acts that become seeds of trust. She folded her hands. Let us carry this essence beyond today's visits, beyond this pilot, into every encounter life offers. They set out, now less burdened by checklists and more guided by intention. At Mrs. Alvarez's doorway, the volunteer paused before speaking, recalling the garden's fragrance. She offered a cutting of mint, and Mrs. Alvarez beamed as if receiving a rare gift. A teenager, remembering the pebble of listening, set aside his phone and joined Mr. Huang in a quiet game of chess, learning patience in each deliberate move. Mid-afternoon found Eleanor at the neighborhood's small playground. Children's laughter rang out as she sat on a bench with Marisol and her toddler. They shared a loaf of pan dulce and spoke of dreams. Marisol's hope that her daughter might one day become a doctor, the toddler's delight in stacking colorful blocks. In that moment, Eleanor realized that sincerity was not only about offering aid. It was about recognizing the aspirations woven into each individual life. As the sun dipped toward evening, Eleanor returned home, her steps light. She paused inside her apartment and gazed at the framed inscription once more. But now its words felt alive beyond the paper, sincerity as touch, service as invitation. Tomorrow, the pilot would end, but the connections would endure, each volunteer carrying forward the lesson that genuine care transforms landscapes of doubt into fields of possibility. Eleanor turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dim glow. The city hummed beyond her window. Unending, unpredictable, yet woven together by countless choices of honesty and compassion. She closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that her journey was an open door, one she would walk through every new morning, holding her sincerity as both compass and bridge.